How does
The
Russia
bottom,
Ukraine end?
one of two ways. Either we have a huge conflagration,
That's a big
and then
word. What does that word mean?
World War, which may or may not involve nukes. Actually, Mearsheimer says that he thinks a nuke going off is the only way to really stop this thing. He thinks if a nuke goes off somewhere, we will then go right to the negotiating table and say, okay, enough is enough. He says, but when he was asked, how do we get out of this one in a recent podcast, he said, we can't, we're screwed.
Okay.
That was his answer.
Let's unpack that. Hold on. Let's unpack that real quick, because I think that when you say a nuke going off, that does not sound like a U.S. nuke going off. That sounds like a Russian nuke going off.
There's nukes all over the world.
Mm-hmm. You think if one goes off, or at least the thought process would be if one goes off, regardless of the country of origin, everyone runs to the negotiating table.
That's Mearsheimer's sort of base argument. I don't think he's saying it will work.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's saying is that could work.
Because basically that's the prisoner's dilemma. That means that everyone...
It is absolutely the prisoner's dilemma. I've used that analogy talking to people. The other thing is that if you listen to McGregor, Douglas McGregor, you listen to Mearsheimer, you listen to these guys, McGregor and Black. McGregor seems to be the best source. Scott Ritter, who is a controversial character. They say, if you turn on the news, you hear that Ukraine's kicking ass. And that's why we have to give more weapons, because we're so close. We're on the 2-yard line, and we just have to push them over the end zone and solve this problem, right? McGregor and a few others are saying that Ukraine's getting slaughtered, that the media is completely and utterly wrong. And here was an interesting scenario. So when this war first started picking up speed, and it was a very strange thing, the first thing that happened is we heard the war was coming. And even in the press room of the White House, there were reporters saying, what's your evidence? The guy said, well, I just told you. Jake Sullivan said, I just told you. He says, that's not evidence. What's your evidence? And the press wasn't buying it. And then there was back and forth. Like the Brits said something's going to happen. The Chinese said nothing's going to happen. One of the ministers of something or other in Ukraine said, we're not seeing evidence they're going to attack. And so it was this chaos. And at one point, some Russian said, could you send us the dates that we're supposed to attack so we can plan our vacations? Right? It was chaos. And I think there was I think at one point Zelensky said the U.S. was stirring up trouble, was stirring up stress and tension unnecessarily. So I think in the early days, the only one who had a taste for war in Ukraine was the U.S. And I think everyone else was trying to wiggle out of it. And the U.S. just wasn't going to let it happen. And then the war starts, and the footage was very telling. And I kept saying to my wife, this doesn't look like a war. And she said, what are you talking about? And you'd show bombed out buildings and stuff. I go, but you can't see the war. That's a bombed out building. I don't know what that is. And so what I did in my year in review, I actually sort of insulted myself. I say, well, Mr. Smarty Pants, there's no, what about all these horrors? And I showed 8 photos of just wiped out buildings. And then I said, yeah, those are horror stories, but they are in order, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever. Ukraine, 2016, Ukraine, 2022. I think one of them was Baltimore, one of them was Detroit, one of them was somewhere in the Middle East. And I said, see how easy it was to convince you that there's a horror story? And I said, they were just showing us pictures of shit that you couldn't say that's evidence there's a war. And in fact, some of the footage of Mariupol, the destruction looked like it had long since passed, and it was decaying buildings and stuff. And the explosions were, M80 to dynamite-sized explosions in the middle of a street hitting nothing. And then you'd see a car on fire. You'd see some mother squealing about how awful it is. But the really big explosions were too far away to know what blew up. And so there was just, I was looking for the show me the smoking gun of this war, and I couldn't find it. Now, what I'll tell you is I think the blowing up of the pipeline in the Kerch Bridge caused Putin to change, and I think he's inflicting horrific pain on Ukraine now. So the war did start. But there was even images of, guys with Russian tanks talking to civilians. Now, there was a great Newsweek article by a guy named William Arkin, who I discovered relatively late, in which he wrote about the evidence that Putin was not inflicting civilian casualties and was not trying to destroy the infrastructure because he believed that he would have to rebuild it. And so he was attempting. And so at the very beginning of the war, Ritter says, here's what Putin's going to do. Before it started, really. He said, Putin's going to suck the Ukrainian military to defend the cities. And then he's going to do an end run and get to the military targets he cares about. And he's going to avoid urban warfare at all costs. He got slaughtered due to bad decisions made in the Chechen war. And the casualties caused him so much political problems. And so he was avoiding casualties at all costs. And there were all these stories coming out, and then turns out they wouldn't hold up, like the Bucha massacre. And you find out that there's bodies lining the street, all those dastardly Russians, and you find out those pictures didn't start showing up until 3 days after Ukraine had control of Bucha. And so you got the Azov guys, who are a bunch of these ruthless Nazis who are willing to kill anybody. I mean, they really are like Colombian drug lords. They're happy to litter the side of the street with it. There was an explosion in a train station, got a lot of press. 50 people died. Oh, those dastardly Russians. And I showed a picture on Twitter of the missile, and it was intact. And I said, here's a picture of the missile. Let's discuss this. And I just left it at that. And it turns out that I had misread the situation. And it's a 2-stage missile. When I first discovered, right away, within a minute and a half, the military guys jump in and they say, it's a 2-stage missile. That's the first stage. That gets jettisoned. That's not the explosive part. I go, okay, I stand corrected. And then some guy says, but those missiles haven't been used by Russia for at least 5 years. The only guys use those are Ukrainians. And I said, okay, that's getting interesting. And then someone says, those are unguided missiles. So if you find the first stage, you find the second stage, you can actually calculate where it was launched from. And it turns out traced right back to Ukrainian controlled territory. Ukrainians were bombing Ukrainians, which they have been doing for a decade now. There are an estimated 15,000 dead ethnic Russians in the Donbass region because they got slaughtered by the Western Ukrainians. This has been going on without anyone in the West giving a goddamn. Where was your yellow and blue Ukrainian flag while that was happening? I didn't know about it. And they were using weapons provided by CIA, NATO, you name it. And so we have been fostering a civil war in Ukraine for 10 years.